The morning fog still clung to the hills as the young reporter pulled his car off Highway 1 and into the quiet coastal town of Carmel by the sea. He'd driven down from the city the night before, nerves buzzing under his skin like static. This wasn't just another assignment, it was his first real shot at something that might actually matter. His editor had handed him the task with a casual shrug. Go talk to Clint Eastwood. He's got some downtime. Keep it light, nostalgic. People love that old Hollywood stuff. At first, he'd been thrilled. Who wouldn't want to sit down with a living legend? But as the days passed and he dug into his prep, doubt crept in. Eastwood was in his 90s now. The man hadn't done many interviews lately, and when he did, they were short, dry, and famously unemotional. The reporter worried there wouldn't be much to work with. Maybe the editor had given him this gig precisely because it was low stakes, safe, predictable, forgettable. That thought stung more than he wanted to admit. He checked his notes one last time before stepping out of the car. Questions like, what's your favorite role? And do you ever miss the golden age of cinema? Filled the page. He'd even jotted down a few gentle prompts about retirement, just in case the conversation stalled. He imagined Eastwood in a cozy armchair wrapped in a cardigan, smiling faintly as he reminisced about spaghetti westerns and Dirty Harry. It would be easy, harmless, and, if he was honest with himself, a little boring. But he needed this. Not just for his career, though that mattered, but because he was tired of writing clickbait listicles and recycled celebrity gossip. He wanted to tell a real story, something with weight. He just hadn't expected that story to involve a man most people saw as a relic. The office wasn't what he pictured. No grand studio gates or rows of security. Just a modest building tucked behind cypress trees, its white paint weathered by ocean air. A single sign by the door read Malpaso Productions, Eastwood's company named after a dry creek bed in Arizona. There was no receptionist, no assistant hovering with a clipboard. Just a quiet hallway and the distant hum of a coffee machine. A few minutes after he arrived, a man in his late 80s, lean, silver-haired, wearing a denim shirt and boots, walked in carrying a rolled-up set of blueprints. He nodded politely. You must be the writer, he said, voice low but clear. The reporter stood quickly, suddenly aware of how young he must seem, how unprepared. Yes, sir. Thank you for making time. Don't thank me yet, the man said with a half-smile. I'm Marty. I handle scheduling. Clint's running a bit behind. He's over at the housing site, helping the crew adjust the foundation plans, said the soil shifting near the bluff. The reporter blinked. He's at a construction site? Marty chuckled. You think he sits around watching his old movies? Man's been up since 5. Rain or shine. The words landed like a pebble in still water, small but rippling. The image in his head began to crack. This wasn't the frail elder he'd imagined. This was someone still building, still doing. 20 minutes later, a dark pickup truck rolled into the driveway. The door opened and out stepped Clint Eastwood. Not with fanfare, not with a swagger, but with the calm stride of someone used to moving through the world without needing to announce himself. He wore work boots caked with dried mud, jeans that had seen better days, and a flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows. His hands were rough, his face lined by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp, alert, taking in everything. He offered a handshake. His grip was firm, not crushing, but steady. Sorry to keep you waiting, he said. Had to make sure the beams were level. Nothing worse than a crooked foundation. The reporter mumbled something about it being no trouble, but his mind was racing. He'd come armed with questions about film reels and red carpets. And here was a man who cared more about load-bearing walls and coastal erosion. Eastwood led him into a small office that felt more like a workshop than a Hollywood executive suite. Bookshelves held scripts. Yes, but also engineering manuals, jazz records, and a well-worn copy of Moby Dick. A drafting table sat in the corner, covered in pencil sketches of what looked like a new house design. On the wall hung a black and white photo of Eastwood as a young man on a ranch, not holding a gun or a movie clapboard, but fixing a fence. Coffee? Eastwood asked, already pouring 2 mugs from a pot on a side table. Sure, thank you. They sat across from each other, the morning light filtering through the blinds. The reporter fumbled with his recorder, suddenly self-conscious. He cleared his throat. So, you've had an incredible career. Over 60 years in front of and behind the camera. Do you ever just Look back and feel amazed by it all? Eastwood took a slow sip of coffee. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the reporter, not with suspicion, but with the kind of quiet attention that made you feel every word mattered. Amazed? He finally said. Not really. I've just been working. One day at a time. The reporter scribbled that down, unsure if it was profound or just polite deflection. He tried again. But surely there are moments you miss. The energy of a film set in the 70s, the camaraderie. Eastwood leaned back slightly. I don't miss what I'm still doing, he said simply. I directed a picture last year. I'm scoring another one now, and this morning, I helped a couple of young builders figure out how to reinforce a retaining wall. That's not nostalgia. That's Tuesday. There was no bitterness in his voice, no need to prove anything, just fact. And in that moment, the reporter realized he'd walked in with a script in his head. One that cast Eastwood as a museum piece, a figure to be admired from a distance. But the man in front of him wasn't a statue. He was alive, present, and utterly uninterested in playing the role the world had assigned him. The interview hadn't even really started, and already the reporter felt like he'd been handed a lesson. He glanced at his list of questions. They suddenly felt shallow, like asking a master carpenter to talk only about the color of his hammer instead of the houses he'd built. Eastwood noticed the hesitation. You okay? He asked. Yeah, the reporter said, forcing a smile. Just adjusting my expectations. That got a small laugh, dry, warm, real. Good, Eastwood said, because I've never been much for giving people what they expect. And with that, the real conversation began, not the one the magazine wanted, but the one the reporter needed. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet morning in a sunlit office by the sea would change how he saw not just a legend, but what it meant to live with purpose, long after the spotlight had moved on. The coffee was still warm in his hands, but the reporter already felt off balance. He'd come in with a neat list of questions, each one polished to sound thoughtful, but now they felt like toys in a room full of real tools. Eastwood hadn't said anything dramatic or loud. He'd just been himself. And that somehow was more disarming than any grand speech could have been. He glanced down at his notes again, searching for a safe place to restart. You mentioned you're scoring a new film, he said, trying to sound casual.
Do you still enjoy composing?
Eastwood set his mug down and leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Enjoy's not quite the word. It's work, hard work, but it's mine. I sit at the piano, try to find the right notes to match what's happening on screen. Sometimes it takes hours, sometimes days. But when it clicks, yeah, that feels good. There was no bragging in it, no hint of, look what I can do at my age. Just the quiet satisfaction of someone who still shows up for the job, even when no one's watching. The reporter found himself nodding, not as an interviewer, but as someone listening to a truth he hadn't expected to hear. He tried another question, this one about legacy. People talk about you as a symbol of old Hollywood. Does that feel accurate to you? Eastwood tilted his head like he was weighing the words. Symbols don't build houses, he said after a pause. They don't stay up late editing a scene because the rhythm's off. I never set out to be a symbol. I just wanted to tell stories my way without someone telling me to cut the quiet moments or add more explosions. The reporter blinked. That was sharper than he'd anticipated. Not angry, just clear, and it made him realize how often he'd written pieces that did exactly that. Trimmed the quiet, amplified the noise, all in the name of keeping readers scrolling. He shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how much he'd assumed. He'd thought this would be a gentle stroll through memory lane, but Eastwood wasn't offering nostalgia. He was offering something harder, honesty. Then Eastwood asked a question of his own. How long you been writing? About 3 years, the reporter said. Mostly online stuff. Quick hits, interviews, trend pieces. Do you like it? The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in a long time, not really. Some days, he admitted. Other days it feels like I'm just feeding a machine that wants more, faster, louder. Eastwood nodded slowly. I've seen that happen to a lot of good people. They start out wanting to say something true and end up saying whatever gets the most clicks. It wasn't judgment. It was recognition. And that stung more than criticism ever could. The conversation drifted then, not in a scattered way, but like a river finding its course. Eastwood talked about the importance of silence in film, how people forget that what's not said can be louder than dialogue. He described sitting on set for hours just waiting for the right light, or the right breath from an actor. Most folks think directing is about shouting orders, he said. But half of it is listening, watching, knowing when to step back. The reporter found himself leaning in, forgetting to take notes. This wasn't the interview he'd planned, it was better. It felt like a conversation between two people trying to figure things out, not a performance for an audience. At one point, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He instinctively reached for it, thumb hovering over the screen. Eastwood didn't say anything right away. He just watched, his expression unreadable, then quietly. If you're waiting for a notification to tell you what matters, you'll miss the whole story. The words landed softly, but they hit hard. The reporter froze, then slowly put the phone back in his pocket without looking at it. His face warmed with embarrassment, but Eastwood didn't press it. He just went on as if nothing had happened, talking about how he still edits his own films, how he trusts his gut more than focus groups, how he'd rather make something imperfect but honest than something slick and empty. There was no lecture, no moralizing, just a man sharing how he'd lived, in a way that made the reporter feel both seen and challenged. Later, Eastwood stood and walked over to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a thin folder and handed it to the reporter. Inside were black and white photos from the set of Unforgiven. Not the glamorous shots used in magazines, but candid moments. Eastwood crouched beside a camera operator, pointing at a monitor. The crew huddled under tarps during a rainstorm, an old ranch hand teaching a young actor how to saddle a horse properly. These were the real moments, Eastwood said, not the premieres, not the awards. This, working together, solving problems, making something that lasts. The reporter stared at the images, feeling something shift inside him. He'd spent so much time chasing the shiny surface of things that he'd forgotten what lay beneath. When they sat back down, the air felt different. Lighter somehow. The reporter no longer felt like he was interviewing a legend. He felt like he was sitting with a craftsman, one who happened to have changed cinema but who still measured his days in effort, not applause. He finally asked the question he'd been too nervous to voice earlier. Do you ever worry that people only see the icon, not the person? Eastwood was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a breeze rustled the cypress trees. I stopped worrying about what people see a long time ago, he said. You can't control that. All you can control is what you do today. Show up, do the work. Be straight with people, the rest, it takes care of itself. It wasn't a quote for a poster. It was just how he lived. And in that simplicity, the reporter found something rare, clarity. By the time the hour was up, he hadn't gotten a single soundbite his editor would love. No dramatic revelations, no juicy behind-the-scenes gossip. But he'd gotten something far more valuable, a reminder that greatness isn't always loud, and that real strength often looks like quiet consistency. As they stood to say goodbye, Eastwood offered a firm handshake again. You ask good questions, he said. Just remember to listen to the answers. The reporter walked out into the coastal sunlight, his notebook nearly empty, but his mind full. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new way of seeing, not just Eastwood, but everything. The reporter didn't leave right away. After their talk wrapped up, or at least after he thought it had, Eastwood surprised him by saying, You got time to walk around a bit? There's something I'd like to show you. It wasn't an invitation wrapped in ceremony. It was just offered, plain and easy, like asking someone to pass the salt. But the reporter sensed it was more than a casual stroll. He nodded quickly. Yeah, absolutely. They stepped out the back door of the office into a yard that felt more like a working homestead than a celebrity's property. There were no manicured hedges or fountains, just gravel paths, tool sheds, and the smell of sawdust in the air. A few yards away, a small workshop stood with its door open, revealing a half-finished wooden chair on a workbench and a radio playing soft jazz. You build furniture? The reporter asked, genuinely surprised. When I can, Eastwood said, brushing sawdust off his sleeve. Keeps the hands busy. And the mind, too, if you do it right. Every joint's gotta fit just so. No room for shortcuts. They walked past the workshop toward a low building with large windows. Inside, a piano sat near a mixing console, sheet music scattered across the top. That's where I work on scores, Eastwood said, not with pride, but like he was pointing out a garden shed. Sometimes late at night. Quiet hours are best for listening. The reporter followed, trying to take it all in. This wasn't the life of a man resting on his fame. It was the life of someone who still believed in making things, with his hands, his voice, his time. Every structure, every note, every decision seemed rooted in the same quiet principle. Do it yourself, do it well, and don't make a fuss about it. As they rounded a corner, they came upon a small community garden tucked behind a row of trees. Raised beds overflowed with vegetables. Kale, tomatoes, carrots, and a few volunteers were tending to them, chatting as they worked. One of them waved when they saw Eastwood. He waved back, then turned to the reporter. Helped start this about 10 years back. Local families needed fresh food and the land was just sitting empty. Figured we might as well put it to use. The reporter stopped walking. He'd read about celebrity charity work before. Gala events, photo ops, big donations with press releases. But this felt different. There were no logos, no banners, no cameras. Just dirt, seeds, and people helping each other. You come out here often? He asked. Whenever I'm in town, Eastwood said. Not to supervise. Just to help. Pull weeds, turn compost, whatever's needed. Nobody cares if you've won awards when there's a row of beans that need tying up. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air. Birds called from the trees. It was peaceful, but not in a staged way. It felt lived in, real. Then Eastwood turned and looked at him, not with the gaze of a star being observed, but with the steady attention of someone who'd seen enough of life to know what mattered. You asked earlier about what's kept me going, he said, as if picking up a thread they'd dropped hours ago. It's not fame. It's not even movies, really. It's curiosity, and not letting fear make my decisions. The reporter felt those words settle deep. He'd spent so much of his own life playing it safe, writing what he thought would get approved, avoiding topics that might ruffle feathers, chasing trends instead of truths. Fear had been his silent co-pilot for years, and he hadn't even noticed. Eastwood kept walking, and the reporter followed. They passed a small recording studio where a young musician was adjusting levels on a console. He's scoring a short film, Eastwood said quietly. I gave him the space and a little guidance. Rest is up to him. There was no mention of mentorship or legacy, just a simple act of passing on opportunity without needing credit. Back near the main path, Eastwood paused. People think discipline means saying no to fun, he said. But real discipline is saying yes to showing up, to learning, to doing the work even when no one's watching. That's where the good stuff comes from. The reporter thought about his own routine, checking analytics before writing a sentence, rewriting headlines to chase clicks, trimming stories to fit algorithms. He hadn't realized how much he'd let external noise drown out his own voice. Until now, standing beside someone who'd spent a lifetime tuning it out. They sat on a wooden bench under a wide oak tree. Eastwood didn't fill the silence with talk. He just let it breathe. And in that stillness, the reporter began to understand something. Eastwood's power wasn't in his roles or his awards. It was in his refusal to perform. He didn't act like a legend. He lived like a man who knew his values and stuck to them day after ordinary day. I turned down a huge deal once, Eastwood said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Studio offered me millions, full marketing push, the whole package. But they wanted final cut, said I was too old to trust my instincts. He gave a small, dry laugh. I walked away, made the film my way with half the budget. It didn't win awards, but I slept fine. The reporter smiled faintly. Most people wouldn't have that kind of nerve. Nerve's overrated, Eastwood replied. It's just knowing what you won't trade. Once you figure that out, the rest gets easier. The sun dipped behind a cloud, casting soft shadows across the yard. The reporter looked around, at the workshop, the garden, the quiet spaces where real life happened, and felt something shift inside him. He hadn't come here looking for a lesson, but he was getting one anyway. Not through speeches or slogans, but through the simple, consistent way one man chose to live. Before they headed back, Eastwood stopped near a small shed where blueprints were pinned to a board. This is for the housing project I mentioned, he said. Affordable units for local workers. We broke ground last month. He pointed to a detail on the plan. Had to redesign the foundation twice. Soil's tricky near the bluff, but it'll hold, if you build it right. The reporter nodded, but what stayed with him wasn't the engineering. It was the care behind it. At an age when most would have retired to comfort, Eastwood was still solving problems, still investing in the future, still showing up. As they walked back toward the office, the reporter realized he hadn't taken a single note in the last hour, and it didn't matter, because what he was learning wasn't meant for an article. It was meant for his life. He didn't know it yet, but this walk, this quiet afternoon filled with sawdust, soil, and straight talk, would become the heart of everything he wrote from that day on. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and sometimes truth doesn't shout. It just waits patiently for someone ready to listen. The drive back to the city felt longer than the trip down. Not because of traffic. Highway 1 was clear, the ocean stretching out calm and endless beside him, but because his mind wouldn't settle. He kept replaying moments from the day. The way Eastwood's hands moved over a blueprint like they were reading a familiar story. The quiet pride in his voice when he talked about the garden. The unshakable calm in his eyes when he said, "I don't let fear make my decisions." Those words kept circling, not as a quote to be polished for an article, but as a question aimed straight at him. What decisions have you let fear make? He'd expected to walk away with a tidy profile, something warm, nostalgic, safe. Instead, he felt untethered, like someone had gently shaken the foundation of how he saw his own work. For years, he'd told himself he was just playing the game, writing what editors wanted, chasing metrics, smoothing out anything too raw or real to keep things accessible. But sitting across from a man who'd spent 9 decades refusing to play by anyone else's rules, that excuse suddenly sounded hollow. Back in his apartment, he opened his laptop and stared at the blank document titled, "Clint Eastwood Interview Final Draft." He typed a few lines, then deleted them. The usual framing, legend reflects on storied career, icon shares wisdom from golden age of Hollywood, now felt like a costume that didn't fit. Eastwood hadn't talked about golden ages. He'd talked about showing up, doing the work, and staying true even when it cost you something. That wasn't nostalgia. That was a challenge. He closed the file and opened a new one. No title this time. Just a blank page and a deep breath. He started writing. Not for clicks, not for his editor, but for the version of himself who'd once wanted to write because he believed stories could mean something. He described the workshop, the garden, the quiet intensity in Eastwood's voice when he said, "Symbols don't build houses." He wrote about the moment his phone buzzed and how a single sentence, "If you're waiting for a notification to tell you what matters, you'll miss the whole story," had hit him like a bucket of cold water. He didn't polish it. He didn't inflate it. He just tried to be honest. Hours passed. The city lights blinked on outside his window, but he barely noticed. For the first time in a long time, writing didn't feel like a chore. It felt like remembering who he was before he started trimming his thoughts to fit someone else's mold. The next morning, he sent the draft to his editor with a short note. "This isn't the piece we planned, but it's the one that needs to be written." He braced for pushback, for demands to add more star power or viral moments. But the reply came faster than expected. "Read it twice." Ran it by the team. "We're running it as is. People need to hear this." The article went live a week later. It didn't have a flashy headline. No shocking revelations or what he said next will stun you. Just a simple title. "Still Building a Morning with Clint Eastwood." To his surprise, it spread, not in a viral, algorithm-chasing way, but steadily, quietly. Messages poured in from readers. A young filmmaker saying it reminded him why he picked up a camera. A teacher who shared it with her students. An older man who wrote, "Thank you for showing us he's still just a man who cares." But the real test came a few weeks later, when he got a call from the magazine's office manager. "There's a package for you," she said. "No return address. Just your name and a note that says, 'For the writer.'" His heart jumped. He knew somehow before he even saw it. Inside a plain brown envelope was a single sheet of paper, slightly creased with handwriting that was steady but unhurried. It read, "Thanks for listening. Keep asking real questions." At the bottom, just Clint. He didn't post it online. Didn't show it off. He pinned it to the corkboard above his desk. The same desk where he'd once rewritten headlines to chase traffic. Where he'd deleted honest sentences because they weren't engaging enough. Now that note was his compass. Months passed. He kept writing, but differently. He said no to assignments that felt empty. He dug deeper on the ones that mattered. He stopped checking his phone every time he sat down to work. And slowly, almost without noticing, he started feeling like himself again. Not the version shaped by metrics and trends, but the one who believed words could connect people, not just capture attention. One rainy afternoon while sorting through old notebooks, he came across his original interview questions for Eastwood. He read them and almost laughed. They felt like artifacts from another life, polite, safe, and utterly disconnected from the truth he'd stumbled into that day in Carmel. He didn't throw them away. He tucked them into the back of a drawer, a reminder of how far he'd come. He never interviewed Eastwood again. He didn't need to. The conversation had already done its work. It hadn't been about fame or film history. It had been about integrity, about what it means to live by your own code even when the world rewards you for doing the opposite. And in a time when so much felt loud, fast, and disposable, that kind of quiet consistency was more powerful than any grand speech. Years later, when someone asked him what made a story worth telling, he didn't talk about drama or twists. He said, "A story matters when it helps someone remember what they already knew but forgot, like the value of showing up, or the courage it takes to stay true when no one's watching." He never mentioned Eastwood by name, but the lesson was there, woven into everything he wrote from then on. Not as a legend on a pedestal, but as a man who proved day after ordinary day that real greatness isn't about being remembered. It's about how you choose to live while you're still here. Years later, on a quiet Sunday morning, the reporter sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of printed pages. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes in the air. He wasn't writing for a deadline or chasing a trend. He was just working on a book now, not an article, about ordinary people who'd chosen to live with quiet integrity in a world that often rewards noise over substance. It was a slow project, the kind that wouldn't trend on social media or rack up millions of views, but it felt honest. And that was enough. He still kept Eastwood's note pinned above his desk, though the paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. He didn't look at it every day, but he knew it was there. A silent reminder that real impact doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from standing firm in what you believe, even when no one's watching. He often thought back to that day in Carmel, not as a fan recalling a brush with fame, but as someone who'd been handed a mirror. Eastwood hadn't performed for him. He hadn't recited rehearsed lines about legacy or dropped famous quotes for sound bites. He'd simply lived right in front of him in the way he always had, with focus, humility, and a deep respect for the work itself. And in doing so, he'd shown the reporter something far more valuable than a good interview. He'd shown him a way to live. The article he'd written after their meeting had done more than he ever expected. It hadn't gone viral in the usual sense, no flashy headlines, no celebrity reposts, but it had found its people. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about character. Young artists sent him letters saying it gave them permission to trust their instincts. One reader even started a small community garden in their neighborhood, inspired by the one Eastwood helped build. None of that had been planned. It just happened quietly, the way real change often does. What struck him most looking back wasn't what Eastwood said, but what he didn't say. He never claimed to be special. Never acted like his age or fame gave him a pass. He fixed fences, built houses, composed music, mentored quietly, and showed up for his community. Not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. That kind of consistency over decades was its own kind of heroism. Not the kind that wins trophies, but the kind that builds a life worth remembering. The reporter had learned to stop chasing the idea of making it big. Instead, he focused on making his work matter, to himself first and then to whoever might read it. He turned down assignments that asked him to twist the truth for clicks. He spent more time listening than talking, and he stopped measuring success by numbers on a screen. Real connection, he realized, couldn't be quantified. It was felt, in a letter from a stranger, in a conversation sparked by a sentence he'd written, in the quiet pride of knowing he hadn't sold out his voice. He'd also learned the value of silence. Not the empty kind, but the thoughtful kind, the space between words where meaning grows. Eastwood had mastered that, both on screen and off. He knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all, and just let your actions speak. The reporter tried to bring that into his own life. Fewer reactive posts, less noise, more presence. It wasn't easy in a world that rewarded instant reaction, but it felt right. One afternoon, while visiting his hometown, he passed a small theater showing a classic Eastwood film. He went in on a whim. The audience was a mix: young film students, older couples, a few kids curious about old movies. As the opening scenes played, he watched their faces. No one was checking their phones. No one was rushing. They were just there, absorbed in a story told with economy, emotion, and respect for the viewer's intelligence. It reminded him why he'd fallen in love with storytelling in the first place, not for fame or followers, but for the chance to say something true in a way that might resonate with another human being. After the film, he walked out into the cool evening air feeling grounded in a way he hadn't in years. He thought about how legends aren't made in moments of grandeur, but in the daily choice to show up with integrity. Eastwood hadn't become a legend because of one iconic role or award. He became one because for over 60 years he refused to compromise what mattered to him: creative control, honesty, hard work, kindness without fanfare. The reporter never became famous. He didn't win major awards or land a TV show, but he built a body of work he could be proud of. He wrote stories that helped people feel seen. He mentored younger writers the way Eastwood had quietly guided others, not with lectures but by example. And he lived a life that aligned with his values, even when it cost him opportunities. In the end, that was the real lesson, not just from Eastwood, but from the whole experience. Greatness isn't about being remembered by everyone. It's about being true to yourself so consistently that your life becomes a kind of quiet testament. You don't need a spotlight for that. You just need to keep showing up, doing the work, and treating people with respect. As he walked home that night, hands in his pockets, he smiled to himself. He hadn't set out to write a story about a legend. He'd ended up writing one about what it means to be human. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important story of all. Years from now, if someone asked him about Clint Eastwood, he wouldn't talk about movies or fame. He'd say, "He taught me that the most powerful thing you can be is yourself, steadily, quietly, and without apology. And that, more than any headline or highlight, was the legacy worth carrying forward."